Just a bit about the Afghan Voices series. It's sponsored by the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, co-sponsored by the Asian Institute, both here at the Monk School of Global Affairs, University of Toronto. And special thanks to my co-host Ajmal Muradzoy, who will introduce our speaker in a bit. As we know, Afghanistan is complex, it's diverse, it's changing. And in this series, what we do is we invite Afghans from a variety of perspectives to reflect on the past 20 years, from the US invasion in 2001 to the Taliban takeover last year. And the idea is that in doing so, they will link their own personal stories to questions about Afghanistan's past and Afghanistan's future. And so to introduce our speaker, we have Ajmal Burhanzoy. Ajmal, as some of you will know, is writing a PhD dissertation at the University of Toronto in the Political Science Department on the fate of leftist political parties in Afghani political history. And so I turn it over to you, Ajmal, to introduce Bilal Sarwary.
Thank you, Ed, and welcome to all our participants, and especially to Sarwary Saib, who's very generous with his time to accept our invitation and be willing to share his experiences with us. Just a few brief words about Bilal Sarwary. He's a very veteran journalist who has worked with major outlets in Afghanistan, but mainly with BBC, who he worked with as a journalist for 14 years. He graduated from Middlebury College in 2010, majoring in international relations. He's an independent scholar who is focusing on central linkages between warfare, drugs, and terrorism. And that's what he terms as Farcification of the Taliban, where he draws a comparison between the Taliban and the then insurgent group in Colombia, which we know as FARC. He's currently in Mississauga, and we are very delighted to have you here, Mr. Sarwary. I think we could start by listening to you tell us about how you became who you are, your story, the journey, and also maybe you could tie it then to how you end up understanding this biggest turmoil that, well, not maybe the biggest, not the first time, but one of the biggest turmoils in the Afghan political developments, the takeover of the Taliban for the second time of Afghanistan, and how do you process that? And then maybe we could develop further into the discussion of hopes, challenges, and also some recommendations and how we could deal with the situation. So the floor is yours, Mr. Sarwary.
Thank you very much for having me. It's my pleasure to be with you. I mean, when the 9/11 attacks happened in 2001, I was a refugee in the Pakistani city of Peshawar, like millions of other Afghans. I was a salesman, and then these attacks, they really altered my life and the life of millions of Afghans in ways that one could not imagine in hindsight. In the next sort of 24 hours, there was a massive influx of foreign and Western reporters, and from being a salesman with having no future, you know, as an Afghan, I was in the thick of it. I basically started working, you know, with the media, first with Abu Dhabi TV, crossing into Afghanistan when the Americans started bombing against the Taliban. So the Taliban were still in power. And for me as an Afghan, it was sort of, you know, a painful reality that I had left the country as a kid during the Civil War. And here I was again going into the country, covering a war, you know, not knowing that I would become the accidental journalist, that it will not be just a translation job. So I remember the Americans carrying out airstrikes against the Taliban, you know, toppling that regime, but not finishing it. And very early on, you know, I saw how there was a window of opportunity to engage in a negotiated settlement. Obviously, the 9/11 attacks at that time meant that there was that sense of revenge, and that window for a negotiated settlement was closed earlier on. And I saw that from my own reporting that there was a genuine willingness among a filing rank within the Taliban that they wanted to negotiate. Perhaps a lot of their fighters and mid-level commanders, they went back to their own villages. The leadership, they crossed into Pakistani cities where they got help and support by Pakistani military and intelligence, a fact that has been well documented over the last 20 years. I think the other biggest, mistake, perhaps a lesson for Afghanistan and for myself as a reporter was the fact that the United States invaded Iraq, and that invasion sort of hijacked the resources and attention. And Afghanistan sort of became the forever war for the Americans, and for the rest of the international community. We would see the Taliban insurgency developing, into a very lethal and deadly one. The Taliban, from having few pickup trucks and heavy machine guns or anti-aircraft weapons in 2001, would start to acquire, the ability to have roadside bombs, to have suicide truck bombs, the so-called Iraqization of the insurgency, the fact that Al-Qaeda over the last 20 years, transformed the Taliban into one of the most lethal insurgent groups, not to forget the sanctuaries that the Taliban enjoyed, inside Pakistan and the support from the Pakistani military and intelligence. And I guess for me, that journey got very, very personal because I ended up getting a scholarship into the United States where I studied for 4 years. And Afghanistan, in my view, was a country between hope and fear, especially, that period between 2010 to 2014. And then we had the, successful US presidents, announcing extra number of troops in their thousands, the so-called surge, and then announcing that the United States would leave Afghanistan. Again, that window to have a successful peace process was there between 2014 and 2021. And I feel that the massive miscalculation by former Afghan governments, both under President Karzai and President Ashraf Ghani, and the insincere sort of allies that Afghanistan had, in terms of the US and the United States and sort of the regional dynamics, meant that Afghanistan, quite tragically, didn't get a peace process that could lead to a comprehensive and permanent ceasefire, a peace process that could guarantee, the long-term peace in that country. And for someone like myself, I had hoped that, we will not have to live what happened to us as kids in the 90s or 80s, I'm talking about the civil war. I'm talking about the rise and subsequent fall of the Taliban. But obviously, our optimism was proven wrong, and Afghanistan, quite tragically, saw unprecedented levels of violence and unprecedented levels of brutality. And we saw with our own eyes how, there was a very concerted effort, to basically have a military takeover, and Taliban were able to actually take over, Afghanistan. The peace process failed. There was a very deadly, campaign of assassinations targeting civil society, people in media and journalism, capable Afghans. And we all now can relate to the images of Kabul falling on August the 15th, where I would find myself covering that, not as a translator in 2001, but this time as a reporter telling the world. And with that, I was sort of forced to leave, my home, Afghanistan, my city, Kabul, a country that I had invested my dreams in. And the dreams of my baby daughter, Sola, were shattered like the millions of others. So as a result, we were forced to leave Afghanistan, and I had to, make Canada my home. I'm grateful to be here. And I guess I would leave it there, sorry that it was sort of a very scattered synopsis of the last 20 years, but I'd be happy to take questions from here on. But I would obviously insist that for me, the last 20 years were about a number of missed opportunities and mistakes, what Afghanistan could, which quite tragically couldn't be, given the fact that there were sacrifices made by the United States, by the international community, but above all, by the people of Afghanistan. And I guess learning from those mistakes, one could look at a future where we could restart efforts to have a successful peace process this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sarwary. That's fascinating, that you have been there in the trenches from the very beginning. And I just realized your daughter's name is Sola. It's a beautiful and very, very optimistic name. Great. So that brings me to this, what you mentioned about the peace process, the missed opportunities, the willingness at the very beginning of the Taliban rank and file to engage. This is one of the questions at the forefront, and with what's happening right now with the ban on high school for the girls. Some analysis is that it's the Taliban are doing this to have a bargaining chip at the table and have something to play with, right? When they come to negotiations over recognition, frozen assets, whatnot. So if you will, from your perspective, tell us, how do you see the situation right now? Should we engage Taliban? Should the West engage Taliban? The question of recognition, the question of giving in to their demands. Where do you see the process going, and what are your takes on it?
Well, I think to start with, we should all hold the Taliban responsible as the de facto rulers of Afghanistan. The Taliban are not the insurgent group. Today, the Taliban control the country. So with that control, rightly comes the responsibility. So that's number one. Number two, to put things into context, we have to also understand why the process failed, or why efforts to start a peace process failed. Because the key components that would have guaranteed a successful peace process failed. A, the Afghan government was never part of these negotiations, and the Taliban actually managed Afghanistan over militarily because they believed in a military solution on the battlefield. And I think going ahead from here on, we should make sure that the Taliban, only simply be listening to Taliban statement. I think on the issue of women's education and girls' education, and Afghan women simply, the brave ones demanding their rights on the streets of Kabul, that they be not shot at by the Taliban, that the Afghan media be allowed to flourish, which is something that the Taliban have not done. So there are a number of great cases and evidence which shows that the Taliban have not been delivering on their promises. At the same time, within the Taliban, there are three groups, and apologies that I've been very, very repetitive about them, but I would like to, again, divide the Taliban into three groups. The political leadership, or the savvy ones, those that were in Doha, the ones that got exposed to Western government, sometimes at the highest echelons, Taliban, President Trump, Taliban leaders appearing, with US foreign secretaries, for example, at a time when the legitimate Afghan government or the Afghan government in Kabul, was not basically able to meet up with US officials or get that sort of recognition. So this group within the Taliban is very keen to secure international legitimacy and funding because they understand the importance of it. Then you've got the military leadership, the commanders, the rigid ones, the ones who have been heavily influenced by Al-Qaeda. They really don't care, you know. They believe in a military victory. They have been historically, ideologically, influenced by Al-Qaeda. They have been having intermarriages. They have been living and fighting alongside these foreign fighters. And then you've got the ordinary fighters, you know, the village level Taliban soldiers who have a lot of grievances, have lost family members, all they have known is fighting. And suddenly, they have been brought into from rural areas into urban areas, into cities like Kabul. And the Taliban propaganda machine of the last 20 years literally brainwashed this generation of Taliban fighters, telling them that everyone who was living in a city, an urbanist, was basically sort of apostates, you know. And suddenly they don't have any idea how to police the city of Kabul. So instead of stopping someone in the car, they have started shooting a number of civilians, like a doctor in Kabul, a woman in Kandahar. You know, they really don't know how to control the high crime rate. So this is where the Taliban are. And this is why you have, you know, public differences within the Taliban leadership on issues of not allowing women's education. So how the Taliban overcome their internal differences, you know, the rivalry between Southern Taliban and the Haqqani network, you know, for example, will ultimately how successful the Taliban can be. It's also important to mention that the Taliban have not been able to deliver on their promises to the neighboring countries. The Taliban promised Pakistan a peace deal with the Pakistani Taliban, TTP, and that has failed. Since the Taliban have taken over, increase in attacks inside Pakistan. They have had issues with Iran. They have had issues with countries like Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, because the Taliban can simply not wake up the next day and say, hey, Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, here are thousands of your own citizens, militant groups who are fighting with us for 20 years. Here they are. We're going to hand them over to you or to Russia. Because that relationship, that bond is very deep. So at the moment, the Taliban would like the West and the international community and the Americans and everyone else to recognize them because they are simply making a number of nice statements and gestures. But the reality is that they're not treating the Afghan women right. They're not, respectful to the Afghan media, especially to female reporters. And let's also not forget the fact that they have banned music and all forms of entertainment. That being said, the Taliban can prove everyone wrong if they change that, if they learn from the mistake of the last 20 years. And if they say, okay, we're going to appeal to talent, we're going to appeal to capacity, we're going to make Afghanistan everyone's home. Let's have a peace process. Let's have everyone around the table. That has obviously not happened.
Yeah, let me follow up on that. I mean, this is really fascinating. Of course, undercurrent of trouble, sort of concern and troubling sorts of dynamics that we're all well aware of. But let me ask you to develop a little bit more some of the lines of thinking there. First question is one about time. I mean, a lot has happened, certainly in your life, in Ajmal's life, and a lot of people's lives since August. Let me be probably unnecessarily generous to the Taliban, but just for the sake of argument, right? And say it's, we're moving from the Taliban, has been a movement, right? It's never been a governing force. It's never established itself that way. Even given the best of intentions, and we can bracket whether those intentions are there, but given the best of intentions, it would take time to govern in some way that is consistent with, some notion of their values, and we could talk about that as well. So the question is one about time. I mean, has enough time passed to know where this is all going, or are there some areas in which we might begin to expect something more state-like to emerge from the Taliban community and movement in the next year or two? So that's the first question. And the second question is, I mean, you talked about variation, talked about 3 different types of Taliban, and I guess I wonder, can you map that onto space as well? Because as we know, spatially, Afghanistan is quite a varied, varied ethnically, religiously, and so on, and culturally. Can we talk about places where the Taliban looks different, and where maybe there's the chance for some kind of a little bit of splintering, a little bit of drifting away from the essential core message of the central government, such as it is?
Well, in terms of timing, and I would want to add the consequences, the Taliban have a huge responsibility, because as the de facto rulers, they have to first of all ensure that Afghanistan is not used against first its neighbors by these jihadi and militant groups. The number of these fighters is now definitely in thousands. And we have to also remember that the Taliban could perhaps bring down any army to its knees in that region. So say if the Taliban were to get into a fight, like they did with the Afghan national security forces with Iran, Pakistan, or Uzbekistan, I would make an assumption that they would bleed that army, that they would bring it down to their knees, because that's how confident and lethal they are. And we see that from the clashes that they've had with Pakistani, Iranian, Turkmen, and those border guards with those countries, with those neighboring countries. That's first. Second, if the Taliban can't, successfully negotiate a settlement where they can bring everyone and they can secure international recognition, and more importantly, funding to avoid the mass starvation of 20+ million Afghans and to avoid the malnutrition of 1 million Afghan children, then you've got a problem, because the Islamic State in Khorasan is already in the silent recruitment mood. They've been recruiting from both within the Taliban, but also within the former Afghan national security forces. Perhaps that number is small, but that's a worrying sign. And they've been buying a lot of weapons, the Islamic State, especially in the east of the country, from where I come from. And the problem for the Taliban is that they have failed to successfully empower non-Pashtun Taliban, the Uzbeks and Tajiks. And the irony is that in many ways, the Taliban are, repeating the same mistake that the Republic was, repeating. So Daesh could be a potential threat down the line. From what we see, that Daesh is both lethal and they have resources and money, if you believe credible reports that they're buying weapons. But I think in the long run down the road, the Taliban could be facing an insurgency of their own. And the irony is that former Afghan officials who were until 6-7 months ago trying to fight against the Taliban and trying to fight Taliban spring offensives are now actively planning their own spring offensives, perhaps more from Iran and Tajikistan. And that is another sort of, harsh reality for the Taliban, that how can they, for example, now cope with those attacks? And I was looking at footage only yesterday, or the day before yesterday, where for the first time, a Taliban district police chief, looking from his office towards a mountain, confirms that, they came under attack. So the Taliban were doing this for years, and now they are facing their own insurgency, So those are the real threats. But definitely, there is a rivalry, and it's very public now, between the Southern Taliban and the Haqqani network. The network that inflicted some of the most, painful attacks against the American military and civilians. The network that has a historical and generational relationship with Al-Qaeda. The network that have carried some of the most deadliest truck and suicide bombs. And the leader of that network, Sirajuddin Haqqani, is the interior minister. And he's got a $10 million bounty on his head. And he's also appeared for the public in the public for the first time, you know. So for the United States and the international community, Afghanistan is just not a case of, okay, guys, we're done with Afghanistan. We don't care. Whatever happens in that corner of the world happens. There are massive, you know, security issues at stake, you know, geopolitical issues, so to speak, in terms of, you know, the regional context.
So you have talked about not the unitary Taliban, and that's how we should understand it. That I really like that you have parsed it out. But then that to me, and this is where my research kind of falls, when there's factionalization and there are divides within the ruling apparatus, and then we have malignant, or I should say unfriendly neighbors surrounding us, right? That's recipe for disaster. And now the Taliban are trying to centralize, consolidate power, and provide the very basic goods that the governing power should as the public goods. But then we have these maybe competing interests, the regional and international interests that also merge in that geographical location that we call Afghanistan. How do you see these processes intermingling with each other? What do you think the outcome would be? Would the Taliban be able to overcome this factionalization and differences, the big divide between the Southern and the Haqqanis? And like, I'm interested to hear to your thoughts, and how do you see that going forward?
Well, first of all, if we look at the era of 2002, the post 9/11 sort of era, we can see that there was a convergence of interest in the region on Afghanistan. For example, India and Russia, in Iran, in those countries, they were on the same page with the United States back then. That made a big difference, you know, to that military effort, especially in those earlier years. That convergence of interest is not something we saw over the last 2-3 years. I think the region allowed for a military takeover. They let it happen, to bluntly put it, you know. Not only Pakistan, but Iran had, you know, quite close relationship with the Taliban, and Russians and others, even hosting, you know, the Taliban. Today, the region is saying, hey, guys, hold on. You know, the Americans have left, the Westerners have left. It's us that have to deal with the threat of these militant groups that have a specific focus against us, you know. So my prediction is that it might be the region that might, you know, react to the situation before the West and the international community goes back, if they do that, like what they did in Iraq, right, and elsewhere. Secondly, the Taliban have so far failed to show unity. They have so far failed to show leadership and a government that can offer solutions. What do the people of Afghanistan want today? There's high unemployment. There's the massive risk of mass starvation in 21st century. 1 million children face the risk of malnutrition. A loaf of bread is not available. A loaf of bread, you know, just the basic to most Afghans. And we're seeing unprecedented, you know, levels of poverty. You know, we're seeing unprecedented levels of high unemployment. And we're seeing for the first time, Afghanistan is shut to the neighbors for trade. Forget about the aid and everything. The trade that could have generated a lot of money and you know, in terms of rice and wheat and other stuff coming in. So how the Taliban can even get countries like Russia and Iran and Pakistan to recognize them has remained a challenge. You know, even countries like Qatar that generously hosted the Taliban have been publicly castigating the Taliban. So for me, the survival of the Taliban government in power will now depend on a number of factors, you know, on how can they, you know, obtain regional legitimacy. So yes, you will have the Chinese foreign minister keep dashing in and out to Kabul, but he would want the Taliban to hand over ATIM, the East Turkestan Islamic movement. Can the Taliban afford to do that? No, they have failed to deliver to China on that. Is China really able to give the Taliban billions of dollars to run the country, you know? And how can the Taliban manage to unfreeze the assets that belong to the people of Afghanistan from the United States of America, you know, down the road? So I see that the Taliban are fighting on different levels, on the diplomatic front, on the military front. Soon they will be facing that, and on the financial front, how can they secure that, you know? And that's how I see it.
No, that's really interesting. I definitely have a bunch of questions about Afghanistan or the Taliban's foreign relations, and there's a question that was sent to me. But let me ask, before we return to foreign relations, I do want to ask about failures, right? Because it seems like, and I'm not disputing your account, it seems like there's a catalog of failures to deliver on the part of the Taliban so far. So there's a two-part question. The first thing is there a place for discussing the failures to deliver of the previous government, right? And what role that might have played in last August's turn of events. So that's an open question there. And then the second question is, okay, in this catalog of failures that we've seen, where has the Taliban failed less? Right? Like, in what areas do we see the Taliban doing something a little bit more closely like what you would expect a functioning state to do? So those two questions about the sort of the previous government and also the current.
I think you read my mind with the word catalog of errors, because I have extensively used that word both in writing and I agree with you, because if you look at the last 20 years, there's a book of errors, especially under the former governments in the Republic, as well as the United States and the international community. But if I were to tell you the one thing the Taliban have actually done, and they have not failed, is their insistence on a military takeover. They were able to basically take over Afghanistan literally in 11 days, but that 11 days goes back to the last few years, because the Taliban successfully offered a local insurance package to people at a district village level, especially when they heard President Joe Biden announcing that come hell or high water, we're leaving. You know, that announcement in the absence of a peace process, that announcement of withdrawing all forces, including technical support for the Afghan Air Force, was a green light for the Taliban that, okay, guys, we're leaving, you've got no incentive to negotiate. But it is also true to look at the Taliban as sort of the saviors of security for communities in rural Afghanistan. Because when I was in Kabul on August the 15th, when Kabul fell, and I was reporting for a couple of days up until the 17th to the world, I saw that people who had fled the fighting in rural areas, the villagers, they were leaving cities for the villages, because from their point of view, there are no more night raids, there are no more airstrikes. And people who are in the villages, in the provinces, who are government officials or who had family members in the security forces, they were leaving the villages for cities. So there was sort of a two-way traffic developing, right? The Taliban could have said, okay, guys, the war is over. We're announcing a public amnesty and we're going to abide by it. What the Taliban did, they started hunting down former government officials and members of the security forces, forced disappearances. For example, I had no plan of leaving my country. I was committed to staying until the Taliban soldiers and fighters came in knocking on my door for like days, and they know who I was. I was in touch with them. They knew my reporting. So the fact that that space for the Afghan media was simply not there, the Taliban could not tolerate people like us, also meant that they didn't believe in reconciliation. And the Taliban are also facing a massive challenge of not being able to simply distribute passports. People want public services. Fighting may be easy for you, yes. It may have been easy for you to blow yourself up and have an army of suicide attackers. But now how do you deliver? How do you collect revenues, for example? And we know at the moment, we know this. I mean, I've done a lot of work on this and my colleagues have, that the Taliban, since taking over, have acquired, close to $1 billion US, both from the, treasures of the former government, but also the revenues, the money that they've been able to have. And they have not been paying teachers or doctors, they're spending it on opening battalions for suicide attackers. So this lack of transparency by the Taliban, the total absence of Afghan media, the ability, of the Afghan media to challenge the Taliban openly and tell them, okay, guys, why are you spending this money on creating more suicide battalions? Why are you not paying civil servants? What are you doing with this? Also tells us that the Taliban are not entirely honest about their intentions. There are also credible reports in certain parts of the country, especially in Pashtun areas, where the Taliban have been trying to recruit the sons and children of former members of the Afghan National Security Forces who were killed. And they're now coming to families and saying, give them to me, we're gonna take them to a madrasa because you can't feed your kids. And to me, we can't be sure what they're doing with those children, Is this now Al-Qaeda telling the Taliban to do this? Is this the Taliban planning something bigger for the next generations? And this is where I struggle, the Taliban not helping their own case. If they are telling everyone that, okay, we're the government, we're responsible, then they have to act on it, And we're now seeing the UN envoy, Deborah Lyons, the former Canadian ambassador, this amazing woman committed to Afghanistan, publicly coming and criticizing the Taliban and saying, hey guys, you can't be closing the doors to girls' education under the pretext that we will open them when the ground is ready for a condition that goes according to Islamic Sharia. What does that even mean? Afghanistan is an Islamic country. Look at the region. So the Taliban are making it very difficult for anyone to literally, support their case as the de facto rulers.
No, that's great. And let me pivot then to foreign relations, because in a way it's kind of related, because if the Taliban seem almost determined to sever ties with Canada, with the West, one starts to think about alternatives. I mean, alternative patrons, as it were, right? So you briefly mentioned China, and so let me ask you to elaborate on the kinds of ties that we see developing, if we do see any ties developing between China and Afghanistan. There's a book that just came out. I don't think it deals with Afghanistan, but it deals with former Soviet Central Asia, called Sinostan, right? As if there's a visible Chinese expansion into other parts of Central Asia. So I wonder if there's a version of that that is afoot in the Afghan case. And the second question about foreign relations is a little bit different. It comes from Leo Kosals, who asks, are there any, and maybe it goes back to your comments about the Taliban as a fighting force, as a really strong fighting force. Are there some threats that, he says, are there any threats that some militant groups can invade Central Asia from Central Asian countries from Afghanistan? I think is there any concern about spillover, whether the spillover is somehow some Taliban interest in exporting its vision, as it were, or maybe in lightly governed areas where the Taliban actually don't exert control, maybe it's Daesh, or maybe it's the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, some other kind of splinter organization that takes it upon itself to cross the border into former Soviet space. Any sense of on those two questions?
Well, on the question of the threat to Central Asian countries, the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, with thousands of its fighters from that part of the world, have had a 20-year strong relationship with the Taliban. They've been fighting side by side, and they've acquired a lot of destructive capabilities. They've also been influenced by Al-Qaeda. So, how can the Taliban deliver, for example, on their promise of handing them over to Uzbekistan and Russia, or the Ansarullah Mujahid, militant group from Tajikistan? It's been a major hurdle in the relationship currently between Taliban in these countries. Russia, sees that threat to Central Asian countries and eventually to Russian interests. And that threat is real because these fighters have married locally, they speak the languages, they are not easily differentiable, if that's a word, and they are based in northern Afghanistan. I think for Pakistan, as I said, the Pakistani Taliban, TTP, is a major problem. You certainly see Pakistani officials publicly calling the presence of Pakistani Taliban inside Afghanistan. And the irony is that Taliban were inside major Pakistani cities for all this time. So that is definitely there. But we also know how China operates from Africa to Afghanistan. China comes in as a government and they set on natural resources and wealth, and China, I think, from the Taliban will want that. They will want those natural resources, and they will want them to hand over ETIM fighters. We also see that China has successfully got a number of contracts for literally peanuts, start with the copper mine from the former government. So Chinese interests, to me, are very visible. China sees Afghanistan, for those reasons, but I don't think that China will be able to provide the Taliban with billions of dollars, at least not free money, so to speak. And as far as I see the Taliban, this is something that I should have pointed out earlier on. They have had some success in terms of taking over certain embassies in certain countries, perhaps not the official recognition, like the Taliban foreign minister appearing alongside the Afghan ambassador in Turkey shows that they have reached out, to those countries. I don't know what promises the Taliban are making to the Turks, but we know that they are promising a lot to the region, and those promises are not coming into any fruition for the moment.
So we said, let's change the pace a bit towards the positive. It's all doom and gloom. Things are not working. The Taliban seem like they're on a suicide mission as a whole. They're doing things that a rational entity one expects should not do, but they are doing it. But you have been there from the very get-go. You have been to the villages. You have even reported at the very last days before you left Afghanistan. Do you think there is hope? Do you think there is something that's going in the right direction? If not, is there anything we could do? By we, I mean people who have left Afghanistan, who are in different corners of the world like you and I, and people who are still there. Is there something in this whole doom and gloom that you could see that might be a hope for future?
Well, quite tragically, Afghanistan is, what an epic failure in a doomsday scenario would look like. Look at the facts on the ground by credible international organizations. look at what the UN is saying, look at what WFP is saying, the World Food Program. I mean, the fact that 20 million plus people face the risk of mass starvation, the fact that 1 million children face the risk of malnutrition, that children continuously dying after trillions of dollars, after all the blood and treasure, I think should give us, the sort of scenario that quite tragically we don't want to hear about it, but that's the reality. At the same time, if Afghanistan under the Taliban were to restart the failed efforts to start a peace process, if Afghanistan can suddenly have that successful peace process and the Taliban can, form a government where women's rights is there, where girls are allowed to educate, where everyone can come back, then we can see that Afghanistan might be on a road to recovery. That recovery will not be easy, that will take some time. At the same time, and I have to say this at the risk of being criticized even further, some of us who have made it to the West, to the safety of Western cities, we have also miserably failed to create a constructive dialogue. I call it cyber tribalism. The social media discussions are very poisonous. So if you express your view, everyone is ganging up against you, and that cyber tribalism is hurting any chance of a constructive dialogue that could hopefully mean a peace process down the line. And I can understand that all of us are heartbroken and all of us are angry, and rightfully so. We feel betrayed and let down. But that discussion has to be healthy among educated Afghans. Remember, Afghanistan under the Taliban in the 1990s didn't have this generation of citizen journalism. You didn't have the tools, the smartphones, the social media apps. So if you say something or you write something, that has consequences. And for me as an Afghan, perhaps speaking strictly for myself, that is my dream at the moment. How can every Afghan, the educated ones, people with influence, people with Western education, how can we offer solutions? How can we also reflect on the last 20 years, on the failures? And who can we look up to in terms of leadership? Because our generation has been miserably failed, by so-called leaders of the last 20 years. So that could be a way out. But more importantly, how can Afghanistan, manage to secure international funding, but also revive the economy so people don't die because they can't have a loaf of bread, because Afghanistan can also be that stain on the conscience of humanity, in 21st century. And quite tragically, I can't see anything positive to speak about it. And perhaps that was the reality of the last 4 or 5 years for us, because we were losing our friends, we were getting attacked, our names were on hit list, but we stayed in Afghanistan because we thought that we could finally, win the peace, finally see Afghanistan where there would be a permanent and comprehensive ceasefire and a road to a national reconciliation. Obviously that failed.
Can you guys hear me? My internet has been a little bit strange. Is my voice coming through okay? Yeah, okay, fantastic. So Bilal, let me ask sort of one final question, sort of building off your comments there and see where you go with it. So, I mean, I think Ajmal was trying to push you a little bit, but I think we generally share your pessimism. I mean, it's hard to muster a lot of optimism at the moment. The question is, what would change this dynamic? And I think that there's a possibility in some of your remarks for the following scenario. So let me float a scenario and tell me where it's wrong, where it's right, where it might be useful, where it might not be. And the scenario is this: that in the short term, the Taliban seem to be doing everything wrong, but in the longer term, their failures, and there will be failures, right? Probably will come at a cost unless there's some patron who is there to mop up to make it work, essentially to bankroll their failures, right? In the meantime, you talked about the tremendous human capital, right, that has been developed not just over the past 20 years, but probably goes back, right? There's tremendous wealth of education, of talent, of ingenuity, of resilience. I mean, which is something that it can be in short supply elsewhere. I'm sure Afghans are probably fairly resilient people, and these I think are they're useful in terms of building capacity or providing capacity when there's an opening, right? And so no one's predicting that the opening is going to come anytime soon, right? But the question is, how do people, this would include Canadians, Afghans, Afghan Canadians, what have you, people who are committed to the long-term sustainability of Afghanistan, how do they position these people so that we don't lose this human capital, or this human capital doesn't just go off into the private sector in Canada, right? So you may let's say you open a business in Canada, that's terrific for Canada, but when the opening comes, you may not be positioned if you've just shifted careers to help the country back home. So how do we bide our time a little bit such that the opening is there without losing that human capital, I guess is the question. And what could Canadians, let's say, do to participate in this, if you have any sense?
Well, I absolutely can consider myself as a Canadian now, because this is now our home, and very proud to say that it's our second home now. And I want my daughter to basically follow her dreams here. She can be anyone who she wants to be. I think what we can do in this, and many other countries in the US and elsewhere could do, we could make sure that we preserve this generation. Because what has happened since August 15th, you've had some of the most smartest people in their fields with Western educations suddenly popping up all over the place in places like Canada. And we could appeal to their expertise and talent, but we could also make sure that we create that environment. So from within your universities, I don't know, creating, programs for visiting scholars, especially protecting the media. So I do a lot of reporting. Now, from time to time, I'm very busy on social media and stuff like that. Unfortunately, I was hit by a car in Canada, but I survived. I had not predicted that. That would be one way. The other way that I have been extremely impressed with in Canada, in the US, in UK and Europe, a lot of people who work with us over the last 20 years, from media to civil society to people in the militaries, they have sponsored Afghan families. They've not turned their back on their friends, because that relationship is also very, very deep, 20 years, So I think, if anything, this is a very, very good, source of inspiration. And we also have to make sure that the people who are approved to Canada, to US, to Europe, that they are now evacuated safely, that we do not stick to the artificial deadlines and timelines, because the reality at the moment on the ground is the Taliban officials at the highest echelons have prevented Qatari flights leaving Kabul. The Taliban have literally prevented evacuation because there's a lot of money involved in this, and Taliban want to hold the Western countries hostage when it comes to issues like that. So that's number one, because there's a real risk that people who are approved or who should be evacuated, if they're abandoned, they will be killed. That risk is very, very, very high. And we see, the assassinations have not stopped. But as I said, every one of us could play our own role. Universities could offer places for visiting scholars, especially for female colleagues within the Afghan media. And we should not allow the Afghan media to literally dissipate, because that is an asset for the world. we have to start there with the civil society. And, so many great people from so many greater countries have contributed to countries like Canada and US, immigrants, and Afghanistan can be that country. Afghanistan has that potential, to offer doctors and engineers and reporters and private businesses are very attractive too in places like Canada. But we have to make sure that we preserve that generation, and we should not wait for governments. We should not wait for bureaucracies, right? We can take initiatives ourselves. And I want to thank you wholeheartedly, also your Afghan colleague, Canadian Afghan colleague like myself, for allowing this space of Afghan voices. I think we need to allow more and more Afghans to share, their thoughts and how they see what has been happening, because we should not have too many international friends speak on our behalf. Yes, they are our friends. Yes, they have been advocating for us, but we should also hear from Afghans, especially from Afghan women. That would be my humble suggestion.
This is fascinating, Sarwary Sahib, and there's a lot more and much more important things to discuss. But in the interest of time, we are 4 minutes over time. I would like to wholeheartedly thank you. It was a great pleasure to engage with you, learn from you, and thank you for sharing your experience and wisdom. It has been an honor, and thank you very much. I think it's time to end the session, and hopefully we will hear from you in the future. And I could say us wish you a very, very bright future in here, and for you and your family and Sola, your daughter.
Thank you so much for having me. You've been very, very kind. Thank you.
Thanks, Bilal. Don't be a stranger. You're in Mississauga. Come visit.
Thank you. Will do. Thank you. Have a good day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.